All right, and I usually use that self-loathing academic line in non-academic conferences, so I forgot to change the bio, recognizing that this is a USENIX conference. But it's been a while since I've been in academia, but I miss it greatly. So what we're going to talk about today is usability and security in a slightly different area. When you traditionally think about usability and security, you might think about browser SSL warnings, convoluted password schemes, or encryption usability. Does anyone out there know if Johnny can encrypt yet? Is that I heard a no? I heard a no? Yeah, he's been trying to do it for 20 years. Maybe you should try a different profession. One of the things that's common across these different areas is that they're hyper-focused on the end user themselves. And what we're going to talk about today is a slightly non-traditional area of usability in IT security. Why is IT security important? Well, the IT and security operations of your average organization might not have a direct impact on the average consumer and user, but the indirect impact can be very significant. So Target, Adobe, Juniper, all the breaches that you see in the headlines, these result from a compromise of the IT infrastructure of these organizations. And the impact can be direct on consumers, it can be indirect, and it can even result in a meta level of compromise. So Target, for example, was a very direct impact. Over 40 million credit cards records of consumers were affected. The Adobe breach, as a different example, resulted in the compromise of over 150 million user credentials, which then resulted in indirect compromise from attacking those users' accounts on other services where they might share the same password as the Adobe login. And even the most recent backdoor in Juniper's NetScreen products, one could reasonably assume was the result of a compromise of Juniper's IT infrastructure in order for the adversary to implant that backdoor. And we might not never know the full extent of that compromise, but it certainly had a big impact on thousands of organizations that had deployed NetScreen equipment. So I would claim, on one hand, we're doing a lot better in security, at least from a technological perspective. We have hardened browsers with exploit mitigations. We have auto-updating. We're investing a lot in security. And we have relatively safe languages and frameworks, as Matthew will tell us about next. So we must be doing some things right in a world where we have literally $1 million bug bounty for iOS 9 vulnerabilities. But if you asked your average security practitioner, they'd probably paint a very different picture in the face of these daily breaches. So security technology is getting better, but the breaches are increasing at an alarming rate. So there must be something wrong here. And I would claim that it's actually the IT security industry that's failing and resulting in organizations that can't protect themselves. So there's no clear answer about where we're going wrong in IT security. There's no single comprehensive answer. But what I want to focus on today is the intersection of security and usability on a few different principles that we might not otherwise consider. Again, oftentimes security and usability research focuses squarely on the end user and doesn't consider the full environment in which they operate in, which includes the organizations that employ these corporate end users and the industry in which these organizations are involved in. And in some ways, the crap rolls downhill. You have a very complicated, convoluted industry which results in organizations building unscalable and ineffective security programs, which results in a lack of security and usability in the controls that eventually hit the end users. I wanted to share some of these philosophies and stories based on my experience building a security company, namely Duo Security, that services a fairly diverse set of customers across all segments of the market, all shapes and sizes, all types of security cultures and user populations. So I ask to you, the audience, I believe that these are understudied areas of usability and security, and I hope through this exploration it will create a spark for you guys. So first, the security industry, the $88 billion big kahuna to tackle. The security industry, one major problem with the industry is it promotes inadvertently at best, complexity and sophistication over simplicity and usability. And even anecdotally, I can tell you that the word simple and easy in the security industry when talking to customers is looked at in a negative light. That simple must mean ineffective, less sophisticated, less secure, when in reality, that's not the case. And this is very, very bad with a capital B. But if you look at how the industry messages itself, it's not necessarily a surprise. We have aggressive visuals and aggressive messaging. We position security as a battle of good versus evil. We use terminology like kill chains, cyber weapons, and nation-state actors. We quote Sun Tzu's The Art of War as if we're riding into battle as the keyboard cavalry. And this militarization of security is the antithesis of simplicity. It creates a us versus them environment where the real collateral damage is the end users. We also have an obsession with attribution, admiring attacks as opposed to trying to stop them. And we absolve ourselves of responsibility by pointing blame at nation states when their attacks are literally indistinguishable as the ones perpetrated by teenagers. So I hope you appreciate the tongue-in-cheek hypocrisy of the title of my talk. There are no front lines of security. This isn't a battle. We're not warriors, we're guardians. We only exist to make enabling technologies easy and safe for our end users. So if you're a new IT admin who's approaching this madness, if you will, it's a little overwhelming. For every threat out there, there's an anti-threat, and that creates hundreds of product categories in which you must purchase, operationalize, and deploy to your end users to protect them. Now, of course, individually, each of these solutions is not foolproof. Attackers will always find a way to bypass one mechanism or another. So we preach defense in depth. That is, line up 30 of these things serially and hope that attackers not get by every single one of them. So we preach defense in depth, but what that results in is expense in depth. That is, organizations end up purchasing security solutions that might be ineffective or inappropriate for their deployment, with security budgets that they don't have, with operational requirements they can't meet, with a security staff they can't recruit or retain. And the end result is that we end up building unscalable security programs in our organizations and end up focusing on the wrong areas. So if you're an organization, I would hope that you're focusing on the bottom portion of this hierarchy of needs here. The fact that you have an actual security strategy, that you're able to recruit and retain staff, and that you're focusing on the fundamentals before you jump to the top of the pyramid to focus on preventing and detecting nation-state sponsored APT attacks. So what are the fundamentals? If you listen to Eric Schmidt, Obama asked him what the US can be doing better in cybersecurity, and Eric boiled it down to 3 simple things. 1, strong authentication. 2, up-to-date devices. And 3, using encryption. And I agree with this. And I actually think that this is the new CIA of security. It's confidentiality of data, it's integrity of devices, and it's authentication of users. Availability, not very exciting, it's been voted off the acronym. To use a disease control analogy, what we should be doing is washing our hands. It's incredibly effective at preventing the spread of disease, and it's pretty easy to do on a regular basis. But what we end up doing is approaching homeopathic remedies that are unproven. We approach problems of disease control with overkill or with unusable solutions or outright ridiculous approaches. Now, I would attest that we're not actually practicing the basics of security. At Duo, we see millions of enterprise endpoints and mobile devices on a daily basis, and we have some visibility into whether these devices are up to date or not. Now, we're going to start off with Android here, and full disclaimer, Android is complicated. Very complicated ecosystem. We'll leave it at that. Users and organizations, even if they want to update these devices, oftentimes can't due to this complicated ecosystem with a number of players. But when we look across our customer base, we see that 71% of Android devices are out of date. That's not good. It's complicated, but there's still certainly a large risk there. But we'll give Android a pass. How about these OS X devices? I see a whole lot of them in the audience, and it's a different ecosystem. Both users and organizations have full control over whether these devices are up to date or not. And yet, when we look across our customer base, we see that actually 75% of OS X devices are out of date, even more than Android devices. Now, what if we hold up our poster child, iOS? It's hardened. All the updates are controlled through a central party. There's this $1 million bounty to attack this device. It must be pretty good, right? In reality, we see that 50% of the iOS devices used by our customers are actually out of date. So it's clear we're failing to solve some of these fundamental problems in security. Now, I would point out, too, that I think there's some selection bias in this. These might be optimistic numbers. This is from our customer base, so inherently these organizations, I would say, are probably more savvy than average, given the fact that they're deploying two-factor to the users. So a broader population of organizations might be even worse. So one thing we can do is to start advocating and educating to focus on the fundamentals of security. Of all of the compliance frameworks, recommendations, and best practices I've seen, I think of all people, the FTC's Start With Security program actually has some of the most sane guidelines for organizations to focus on security fundamentals. We also need positive models of security and positive security architectures. For every threat, coming up with an anti-threat solution or playing whack-a-mole with every new threat that comes up is not scalable long term. So why don't we invert our model of security and focus on what kind of positive security properties we want to enforce and maintain? And I think Google's BeyondCorp is a good example of this. And if you ask me what kind of security properties are important for an organization that might be positive as opposed to negative, there are things like strong user authentication and authorization, strong device authentication and authorization, and a strong transport security. And if you can do those things, you probably solve 90% of the security problems for 90% of the organizations out there. And that's the philosophy that our customers are following. So the industry definitely sets up a challenging environment for organizations to operate in, but it's not the only challenge that organizations face. In the modern day, all companies are technology companies in order to compete in the market. So all companies need an effective and user-friendly IT security program. We've seen a lot of change over the past few decades, both from a technological as well as cultural perspective in IT security. Certainly, we've come a long way since the days of the mainframe, when all of your users and devices and services were within your four walls. In IT 2.0, we opened up our perimeter to allow for remote access for remote workers. And in the modern day, with cloud and mobile, with your users going mobile and your services going to the cloud, the idea of a corporate network is really just that. It's an idea versus a concrete realization. So a lot of the legacy security controls that we used to deploy might not be relevant when your network is really independent of its network topology. Now, the old Jericho Forum would call this deperimeterization, but in reality, it's a new virtual perimeter that is independent of the network topology. And it follows the same end-to-end principle as the internet. We've taken security technology and controls and moved them from the core of the network to the edges. At the same time, organizations have struggled to change along with the security culture. A lot of organizations are still stuck in the mindset of control. Again, it's an us versus them mentality where the IT admins are the good guys and the users are the bad guys trying to subvert their security and always causing problems and doing stupid things. But if you think about the end user interactions with IT security, it's always negative. Whether it's the AV on your laptop or the web filter blocking your web access or the email filter marking your messages as spam, that interaction is always negative, and it creates a negative mindset with the end user, regardless of whether it's right from a security perspective, because users don't understand what right is. So we have to change this previously sort of named Department of No for IT, where it's no, you can't do that, no, you can't use this device, no, you can't access that service. And as Mike Kale smartly pointed out, change to a Department of Secure Enablement, where users are actually partnering with their end users in order to secure the organization. And this is important because if you fail to do this, what results is what's known as normalization of deviance. And this is a topic that Bruce Schneider actually talked about in his last cryptogram. And originally, a sociologist who investigated the Challenger O-ring debacle noticed in their research that there were certain behaviors and actions within an organization that in a vacuum were considered deviant. They were considered so wrong that you would never expect them to be acceptable. And yet, in an organization and cultural perspective, they became socially acceptable. They became normalized, and they weren't looked at as negative. And this happens in IT security all the time when users are circumventing and undermining security controls that don't mesh with how they think about an organization or how they think about their job. So it's incredibly important that IT organizations combat this normalization of deviance. And one way to do that is by making users part of the solution rather than part of the problem. One way that we've seen organizations do this is by pushing security, authority, and responsibility down to the leads of the organizations. And that might seem like a radical idea. That sounds really scary. I'm supposed to trust my users to make security decisions? They're stupid and they always screw up. I don't think that'll work. But you have to give them usable tools, not a few feet of rope. And this is a model of shared responsibility, where it is IT directly partnering and enlisting the end users in their security program. And this can create a positive security culture where your users aren't subverting your controls. You're turning each user into a tripwire for your organization. One example of this that I really like from Slack, who's one of our customers, they created an anomaly detection system for their production environment. And this is something that's common across a lot of organizations. You oftentimes will raise alerts. They'll go over to a console that your SOC or your security analysts monitor, and they spend all day burning down these alerts, trying to figure out what ground truth is for these anomalous conditions. And it's very difficult. You're essentially creating work for yourself, trying to figure out what's going on. Slack took a very different approach in that when an anomaly is detected, they directly contact the end user who initiated that action and use our technology to ensure that this is a expected outcome, an expected alert, or it's something that the user is not expecting, and maybe it's an actual indicator of compromise. So there's certainly some pros to this approach in terms of efficiency. Now their security analysts can work on things that actually move the organization forward, as opposed to burning down a list of alerts. They also have increased signal, and they've shortened their feedback loop if there's a real compromise going on. But in reality, what they've done is they've enlisted their end users by pushing these alerts to the closest ground truth they can find, the person who actually performed the action, and created a more scalable and automated security program. Another positive example I've seen is that customers are starting to include usability and user feedback more in their IT purchasing process. So we actually see RFPs and POCs. We're getting feedback from the users about how much they like a solution is a critical part of their buying decision. And that's a trend I'd like to see more of. We've actually won deals based on the fact that a user population says, we like that one better. And that's a powerful statement when it comes to IT security. So this raises a couple questions in my mind. Does usable IT security have an indirect positive impact on an organization's security posture? I would say, at least anecdotally, yes. One CISO that comes to mind, a CISO of a large healthcare organization, while our technology solved a clear and present problem for them, it was more of a spoonful of sugar that helped the medicine go down. It was something that the users would actually like as opposed to revolt, and it kind of greased the wheels for all of the rest of the crappy security controls they had to deploy due to their HIPAA environment. So I would say that there is some potentially measurable indirect impact, at least in terms of the organizational capital and the trust that a CISO or a security team is able to build with their user population by deploying security controls that mesh with users' modern expectations. On the other hand, maybe there's a direct positive impact too, taking it a little further, that happy users can have on an organization's security. And this might be at a micro level. Maybe a happy user is less likely to subvert their organization's security controls. Maybe a happy user is less susceptible to social engineering or phishing attacks. And maybe at a macro level, if you have a whole organization of users who look positively at their IT organization, maybe they're more resistant to normalization of deviance. I think this is an area where there's a lot of area for improvement in research. So while we undervalue, in my opinion, the impact that organizations and the industry has on the end user experience, I think that we simply can't ignore the end users themselves. And I really enjoy this quote from Chris Palmer, that we should prefer security systems that people can readily create accurate mental models for, even if they're strictly less powerful than what the state of the art allows. In other words, we can favor safer approaches over more sophisticated approaches to result in greater security. And we can do so by creating a more favorable environment for users to operate in. One particularly morbid example from the 1970s, a number of researchers in the United Kingdom looked at an incredibly steep decline in suicide rates. And they noticed that the suicide methods stayed mostly uniform, except for one method, which was carbon monoxide poisoning by gas. And they saw a steep drop-off from that. And what they eventually saw was that changes in the gas production, moving from oil-based gas to natural gas, and a following reduction in carbon monoxide to almost 0%, was the cause of this steep decline. So the UK didn't ban gas. They didn't change their treatment of mental illness. What they inadvertently did was they decreased the suicide rate by making a safer environment for their citizens. Maybe a less morbid and more stereotypical example is cars. We have seatbelts, airbags, advanced safety controls, all aimed at reducing the impact of a collision and reducing the chance of injuries or fatalities. Now, we're not actually addressing the underlying problem of people being terrible drivers. We're just giving them a safer environment to operate in. So, does this mean we give up on addressing end users? I'm not necessarily in the camp of saying that user security training is completely ineffective, but I would say that we can better focus on efforts on influencing the user behaviors that are safer instead of making them security experts. So, similar to what Adrian alluded to, maybe we can make it easier to do good things and exhibit positive behaviors for security versus our current focus of just stopping users from doing bad things. I think authentication is a classic example of this, not only because of how terrible passwords are, but how terribly we've spun our wheels over the past few decades trying to come up with anything remotely better. So we started Duo about 6 years ago with the goal of making logins more secure and usable. And at the time, the state of the art was still really the RSA Secure ID token. So it's not a high bar to start with. It's pretty low. What we realized is that the RSA Secure ID technology that still people probably in the audience have today, it was actually invented in 1985, which is when Back to the Future movie first came out. So 30 years later, we not only don't have hoverboards yet, but we're still carrying around these little dongles. And when you think about how fast technology moves and how fast security moves within it, it's really quite surprising. So we took a look at the state of authentication. We saw that there are hardware tokens. Certainly, they have a poor administrator experience, poor user experience. They're very expensive. Phone calls and SMSs rely on insecure and unreliable telephony. And software tokens, I'm sure you all experience kind of the countdown timer disorder of trying to race it while you transcribe a 6 or 8 digit number from one device to another. They're also based on symmetric keys, which are suboptimal from a security point of view. And we threw all that out. We said, hey, we have modern mobile devices. They've got touch screens, they've got apps, they've got data service, all these blindingly obvious improvements. And we created Duo Push, which the operation is very simple. You receive a notification on your phone, and to log in, you push the big green button. Pretty foolproof. So it was a clear increase in usability. If you can use a remote control, you can use this. And users were able to create that mental model of why it was securing their logins. Oh, I have this extra device with me, and I pushed the green button to get in. And it was in their face, but then it would get out of their way and let them do their job. And as I mentioned, easy and simple doesn't necessarily mean less secure. We actually had some improvements on the security underlying this that we could rely on strong transport security over the data network, and we could actually rely on asymmetric crypto as opposed to symmetric crypto with OTPs, which means that we can actually embed private keys in these modern mobile devices. So you might often see graphs of security and usability, and it's often stated that if you increase security, you're decreasing usability, and if you increase usability, you're decreasing security. And I disagree with this. This is a fallacy that I think creates a dangerous mindset that leads to compromise and ineffective solutions. I think it is possible to increase both security and usability, but there might be other considerations. Maybe the right representation is a Zuko triangle that includes compatibility. Certainly if we discard all legacy equipment and we ignore the past decades of computing history, it's easy to do security right. So while incrementalism might be bad for security design, it's absolutely critical for security deployment. I would argue that duo push increases both, but certainly smartphones are not universal quite yet. But if you get security and usability right, compatibility will eventually play out as technology cycles through. We now see major providers like Twitter, Yahoo, and Google adopting similar approaches not only for two-factor, but actually as a replacement for passwords altogether. So the once holy grail of replacing passwords is not so far-fetched now. And this is done by introducing a safer mechanism that also relies on the user to be enlisted in security. So to sum up, let's make sure we focus not only directly on corporate end users, but also on the environments, the organizations they operate in, as well as the industry. Matthew, our next speaker, has already done a lot of great work in this area, and Adrian, our previous speaker, while we might not be running experiments at the same scale as millions of end users, I think the impacts can be equally powerful. So it appears my top secret research agenda has been leaked. These are questions that I commonly ask customers in an informal way, but I think they're worthy of more formal investigation. There's lots of academics in the audience, so if these are interesting topics to you, definitely come talk to me. There's also lots of current and future founders of security companies, so we have to keep in mind not only what products we build, but what companies and markets we create, and keeping a focus on usability and security. And lastly, I think that this kind of cross-pollination between academia and industry is absolutely critical in this kind of work. So I appreciate USENIX hosting events like Enigma, as well as Woot, to try to bridge this gap. Thank you.